Hi, my name is Joe Cernik. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University in St. Charles, Missouri, and this is a show called Insight. On the show, we discuss books on politics, both domestically and internationally, sometimes historical books that provide some perspective or insight on the present, and sometimes broader atmospheric or trend analysis books that address issues that need to be addressed in a political setting. Today's book is on China. It's written by Tom Miller, and it's called China's Asian Dream. Now, joining me on the show today are three Lindenwood University students. To my immediate right is Eric Bideri. To Eric's right is James Hechler. And to James's right is Priscilla Adeshejoju. So I wanted to read an opening quote from the book so that you can get a sense of where the author's coming from, and then you can respond to that quote. The author writes, "In 1800, China regarded itself as blessed by heaven, the world's greatest power and its leading civilization, much as the great European nations regarded themselves in 1900. In classical Chinese cosmology, China sits at the center of the world, middle country. China's power reached its peak in the decades before 1800. In the space of a few decades, China's seemingly unassailable position in the world unraveled in a series of catastrophic events. In 1949, when the Chinese secured victory over Chiang Kai-shek's National Party, they set out to rebuild. They took a slogan first used by Chinese intellectuals in 1915 and have popularized it ever since. Never forget national humiliation. The point is that China must rise again. Its leaders talk of rejuvenation or revival, to restore what has been lost. China was once the greatest civilization, the greatest state in the world. It must be so again."
Yeah, the book is showing that China sees themselves as a country that is meant to lead the rest of Asia into prosperity, and they feel that they have the burden to be the link between Asia and the rest of the world.
Absolutely. Going back on a little bit more of a historical perspective here, China for the longest of time was in fact the greatest and most powerful country on earth. There's evidence that shows that even the Romans went back into China over 2,000 years ago and found China to be far greater than they ever were. And that prestige continued pretty much unchallenged until the 19th century, when we see its fall from power through the Opium Wars, the Boxer Rebellion in early 1900, and the end of Imperial China, which has been coined the century of humiliation.
Yes, just like you said in the quote, China must rise again because they've fallen. Now, President Xi in the book is trying to do everything in his power to make China go back to its rightful position as one of the greatest countries in Asia, if not the most powerful. So I find that pretty interesting.
When the author talks about this China's dream, sort of an Asian, difficult, I guess, hegemony empire, that they have some influence more or less over neighboring countries in Asia, the book was sort of saying there's a fear that a lot of this dream is linked to military power, and that neighboring countries are fearful that China is also sort of trying to use this to flex some military power.
Yeah, I think the book said that they linked economic growth with military strength, and they were saying that if the economy grows much bigger and gets stronger, then that gives the opportunity to have a much bigger and stronger military, and that is something that is threatening to the nations that are nearby, that are smaller.
Absolutely, and China, especially in the last 20 years, has been doing a great job of putting on a good show for the rest of the world, basically showing who they are, what they are made of, and what they can do. As an example, during the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in 2014, they were able to basically evacuate the entire population of Beijing and shutter all the factories to give Beijing not only just a clear-looking blue sky, but also just to show, hey, this is what we can do and this is what we can bring to the rest of the world. So.
Yeah, let's not forget that China is not only trying to take away from these neighboring countries, they're actually trying to help their economy as well. So if they have to come into that country and try to do something or take something out of it, I think that should be allowed.
I think one of the things the author was trying to sort of stress is that this is a relatively new development, this idea of Asia, China trying to project sort of an Asian power that he's sort of saying there's a shift that takes place in Chinese foreign policy, and so that between roughly somewhere around the mid-1970s until 1992, the idea was China was trying to lie low, sort of not have a high profile in any way in foreign affairs, but that all changes beginning in 1992. Now you're trying to project sort of a higher profile, so that this is a relatively recent development, only a few decades old.
Yeah, they had to shut down and close themselves off from the rest of the world because they wanted to rebuild and they wanted to change their foreign policy and whatnot. And they realized that if they build themselves up, then they can now be the ones who can influence the other countries because they have much more space and they have a lot more technology and whatnot. So they realize that they should be the ones who build themselves up first, then can build the rest of the people.
Absolutely. And the Communist Party, up until the 1990s, did a very good job of basically sorting out domestic issues at home. The former leader Deng Xiaoping was really good about that, and he promoted that idea of laying low and just being very passive on the world stage. He still expected respect from all dignitaries from other countries visiting, but at the same time he was willing to just go along with the flow of what the other countries wanted. What we have seen with President Xi, for sure, is he kind of, I would argue, he mirrors Vladimir Putin a little bit on his more aggressive foreign policy stance, and he's really seeking that power and control abroad.
Yes, China has always been a little ahead of all the other neighboring countries around them. So they've always had bigger visions and always seen things clearly. China trying to bring these countries together and wanting to make them work hand in hand, I feel like that's not too bad for them.
The book was pointing to something that we have discussed in a previous show where we talked about the Chinese railroad system through Southeast Asia, which is called the One Belt, One Road, so that you're building this railway system from China through Laos all the way to Malaysia, and then in some cases part of this is then to actually set up places where Chinese can subsequently move to cities that would be developed in places like Malaysia. But the book was trying to emphasize that in Southeast Asia, European countries and Japan have had greater investment and contribution to economic development than China. So China, as part of this Asian dream thinking, is now trying to feel that through this One Belt, One Road, they can essentially try to have a greater presence than both Europe and Japan through this sort of a process.
Absolutely. And it has been termed the New Silk Road by this book, and it was also mentioned on the previous show that you had talked about, where not only are they wanting to do infrastructure projects and railways built into Southeast Asia, but they want to recreate the original Silk Road that connected China with the West, such as now they want to build a railroad that goes to Iran via Kazakhstan, and there's also roads planned to be built all the way over to Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan due to the incredible resource fields out there, and China really wants to capitalize on that.
Go ahead.
Yes, just like we said, we already talked about this in the previous book, The High-Speed Empire, that we talked about. The One Belt, One Road is a very, very good, innovative idea that China has put together, linking the West and Asia together, and Africa as well together. I think that's very interesting that they will do this for the rest of the world.
And so that they're also trying to then link up with Sri Lanka and Pakistan so that they have access to seaports, and then the seaports would allow them to have some access down through the Arabian Sea, so that you're looking at sort of how to extend in places that you really had no influence before.
Absolutely. And with this, India and Japan definitely see China as a bit of a threat on the world stage, especially in the case of India with these trade ports that link China to the Arabian Sea via Pakistan. Because now India is basically surrounded on all sides of the ocean by Chinese cargo ships and battleships, and they really feel threatened at this point, and they feel like they can't really do much about it since China is militarily superior to India in pretty much every way.
China is definitely conquering the sea, and the countries like Japan and India, as you were saying, are feeling them getting closer and closer, like by the year. And they are very threatened by it because those are some very important economic sources for them. And China is just coming through and gaining influence around them.
Yes, Sri Lanka definitely would allow China to build seaports in their country because they rely on China's fundings and everything. So it's kind of like a win-win situation there.
Yeah, the book talks about the impact of China on seas and oceans, because it says China's presence in the Indian Ocean raises concerns in India about how rapidly its economic power is translating into military might. And then it goes on, the big caveat is China's recent behavior in the East and South China Seas, where its outrageous claim to vast areas of territory far beyond its land borders is greeted with anger and fear, especially in Japan, Vietnam, and the Philippines. And so again, this sort of Asian dream isn't sort of confined to landmass, but that how you can project yourself in different waterways.
Yeah, I think the whole part of this Asian dream actually is interesting, because it seems like this dream is just, for now, it's mainly China's dream, and they want to impose it on the other countries that are in Asia. But some of the countries are not willing to have that happen. It's like countries like Japan and whatnot. So they're really imposing what they want, and they don't care if people are not with them or with them, but they want this to be achieved because I think it's something that they feel they will have accomplished. It's an accomplishment that they're looking for.
Yeah, this is really a departure from previous dreams and aspirations that China has had in the past. For example, back during the Qing dynasty, which was the last imperial dynasty of China right up until the 20th century, they were really self-sufficient and self-reliant. They didn't really want to expand out any further than their already preset borders, and they really didn't care so much about other countries. They were willing to trade with them, but they didn't want to go much further than that. Now we see with China trying to rebuild themselves and reasserting their role as the most powerful country in Asia, if not the world, they're realizing that they cannot just stay within their borders, but rather they need to go out and expand their spheres of influence around the world.
Yes, I feel like if China has the resources to do all these things, then they should go ahead and do it, even if the neighboring countries don't want them to. And if they want to get the reward or the name for it, then fine, that should work, because they actually put everything down to make this continent a great one.
Absolutely.
Reading from the book here, he says, Beijing claims to have no imperial ambitions. And then a quote reads, China will never inflict its past suffering on any other nation, a leader stated. The Chinese people are resolved to pursue friendly relations with all other countries. Yet, the China dream is in a way a dream of building an Asian empire. And so the author is somewhat questioning China's sort of, let's say, ulterior motives.
Yeah, they're masking it out by using that dream, but I feel like it's just a situation for them to just be the biggest winners, but at the same time let everyone else win. But they don't want them to win nearly as much as they themselves want to win, you know what I'm saying?
it's a different empire of sort with China these days, where it's not they're trying to annex more physical territory, but rather they are expanding their influence into other countries by building these railroads and other means of infrastructure with these small loans that are given out to other countries. And the terms and conditions are set so that these small poor countries can't really pay back China for the debt that was accrued in this building process. So what happens is the terms and conditions call for China to basically continue to control those railroads and roads, even though they are built in other countries, and they're basically given to those other countries.
As he goes on, China's economic diplomacy is most effective in small countries where its leverage is greatest. Those underdeveloped and often fragile states are almost dependent on China. Developed economies, by contrast, have less to fear. Japan and South Korea are powerful countries in their own right.
Yes, for sure. China will definitely attack the smaller countries or go for them because they will easily adhere to whatever China has to offer them. But I honestly would not penalize China for anything that they're trying to do for these countries, because at the end of the day, the countries will develop somehow economically, and even though they would have to pay back for so many years, but it will definitely put them on the map somehow that China has influenced them some kind of way.
China is going with the win-win democracy statement that they put out, and a lot of their banks, especially the big banks, are lending overseas, and they're willing at any point to give whichever small nation a large sum of amount of money and give them an interest rate that at first looks like it's something that is very payable, but then as things are going on, they realize that they can't really pay the whole thing, just like what happened with Sri Lanka. But it's really a contract basically that they're saying, we'll give the money to build our own projects in your country just to make it legally.
Absolutely. One interesting quote that the author makes is when the question is being raised about how worried should other countries around the world, not just in Asia, how worried should they be concerning China's rise to power? And the author argues really not that much. China really just wants to expand their power basically within the Eastern Hemisphere and not much further than that. They realize that the United States had set basically the pre-World War II order, and I really don't think China will go that far to try to establish themselves as the sole superpower in the world, because the author argues that basically China believes in a multipolar control balance in the world. So with that in mind, they really don't have any aspirations to overtake the United States and assume more control of the United States. Number one, they're the biggest trade partners in the world together, China and the United States. So for the sake of everybody, they definitely want to continue that trade and keep that cash flow going.
Well, I think the way he tries to present that is to say it's going to be difficult for China to usurp U.S. power in sections of specifically Southeast Asia or South Asia. So that I think the fear that would be expressed by countries is that, well, China will come in and completely replace the United States as the power source. And if that's not going to happen, then he's trying to say, okay, there's some concern, but we don't need to raise it to the level of a hysteria level.
Yes, that's the exact reason why the author mentioned that China targets smaller countries so that they can extract economic benefits from them, and they cannot really necessarily attack or target bigger countries like America or maybe Japan, because they know they can't really extract so much from these countries or benefit anything.
I like that China is just, they're not saying that they want to be the only power, they want to share it, and they want to have equal responsibility with the other superpowers. They just want to have their own area of influence while the other ones have their own area of influence.
What's interesting compared to the European Union and the United States in this regard as being this multipolar world of power, China really just stands alone. They don't really have a whole lot of alliances or support groups like the European Union has, and especially the United States, because China doesn't really have a whole lot of military bases outside of China compared to the United States, where the United States basically has military bases on every continent and in all corners of the world.
China started this Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and so that what you're looking at is 21 countries are involved, but China is perhaps the one with the biggest amount of money in it, and so here he's looking at certain institutions that receive a great deal of Chinese money that are involved in the economic development of other lesser Asian countries.
Yeah, basically the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is almost like the World Bank of some sort, but for Asia. They want to just have money ready for any of these smaller nations that need the economic help to just receive it instead of waiting for a World Bank to tell them, oh, we can have this much or you can't have this, you know. So they want it to be much closer to home so that it can be as efficient and effective as possible.
Absolutely. One thing to remember about the World Bank is that while it is accessible for pretty much all countries and members of the United Nations, it is basically the United States and the other NATO powers that really exert the most power and control over that bank. So this Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is really a response by China, basically saying, hey, we can actually do this on our own, and we really don't need other support from the outside world to accomplish our dreams.
Yes. One thing I want to add is the author talked about China creating the AIIB was because they just want to make sure that China is that Asia is an ambitious continent, and they want to put them back on the map like it used to be.
When I'm reading the book, now as I said, he sees a change beginning in Chinese foreign policy around 1992, but he also seems to see a change even more recent than that, only going back 4 or 5 years. So he says things like, no Chinese leader before recent developments has ever had the gumption to talk about an Asian Pacific dream under implicit Chinese leadership. And then he says China is preparing to play a much more active role over its borders and is ready to underpin its diplomacy with huge economic grants. And so then he goes on and says we're starting to see sort of some of these developments only since maybe around 2012, which isn't that long ago, some 7 years ago. So that I think he's trying to figure out where we might be, say, a decade from now.
Yep, absolutely. The author divides up recent history of China ever since 1949 into basically 3 periods. First period was Mao and his reuniting the country after decades of chaos and anarchy and basically bringing everyone back together. The second period was Xiaoping basically builds up the economy. He settles a lot more domestic issues at home, just really gets a nice firm foundation going. And in the third period, which basically started, like you said, back in 2012, we have President Xi basically having these high aspirations and wanting to restore China to its former glory, and we really see that being carried out in today's world.
Yeah, they split how they were going to come up as a world power, and they gave it 30 years period between each, so that they could be as effective as possible in each period, make sure they master the craft, and then move on to the next level. And now, as you can see in 2012, they were ready to become the superpower that they're meant to be.
I'd like to add to that because the author also mentioned that in the first period that the power of the Communist Party strengthened China after so many years of humiliation. So I think that's from the 1800s, like the opening quote stated. So now China is trying to come back to being what it used to be.
This Asian Investment Bank that started, and then you ended up 21 members, he's saying that the United States tried to prevent it from getting off the ground, and then the United States denied doing that, and so he calls the U.S. policy disingenuous, and that as a result, by the U.S. trying to persuade friendly countries to the United States to not be involved, they turned around and joined because essentially the United States told them not to. And so he says this seems to be the engine that's sort of driving this Asian dream of China.
What's interesting is that the Communist Party and President Xi in this day, they, along with promoting this Chinese might and power on TV and during state dinners and meetings, they're really asserting themselves as they are really the only mechanism that can be used to bring China back to its glory days. There really isn't any other way. I personally think it's the Communist Party just wanting to continue and exerting control. The author also mentions that there are a bit of domestic issues back in China at this time, and what the Communist Party is doing is trying to unite the country under this strobe of nationalism to try to bring the country back together and keep that dream going forward.
We only have a few minutes left, so when you're looking at this book, what do you think of it? Do you recommend it to viewers?
Yeah, this book definitely shows the plan, the long-term plan that China has always had and that they plan on carrying out. And it's very detailed and an interesting read to have, and I would definitely recommend it for someone that wants to learn more about China and their ascending to being a world superpower.
I definitely think this book makes a great companion book with the High Speed Empire book that we did a few weeks ago on the show. Basically, the High Speed Empire basically goes through the technological and more logistical aspects of this Asian dream that China has, whereas this book here really just gives a more historical perspective, and it shows what China wants to do going forward from here.
Yes, I agree with what both of you have actually just said. I would definitely recommend this book because it shows how hard China has been working to get back to its rightful position, the Asian dream. So for sure, if I want to recommend this book, I'll definitely say yes, go ahead.
Yeah, sections of the book are very interesting. They provide a way of understanding how China is trying to reach out. The sections addressing that you have things called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the International Monetary Fund, which have existed for many years, and that he's trying to point out that these are organizations with China can't really get a foothold or a toehold to be a significant member, which is why they tried to set up these other Chinese-led investment banks, and that as a result it's through these organizations, not through things like the International Monetary Fund, where you're trying to then have a lot of influence in Asia, particularly in weaker countries, as you're trying to expand. And he isn't just talking about Southeast Asia, because he also spends a lot of time addressing issues in Central Asia and how China is expanding, and then trying to figure out how Central Asian countries are responding to China expanding, which is needed for things such as the creation of oil pipelines. And so this is a good book, and I think you can enjoy it, and thank you for joining us today.